Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at none other than Warlock. Warlock has been pretty much non-existent in the game ever since he came out. He was only kind of relevant for a very brief window when he was released, but after that he basically fell off very quickly. The level of upgrade that he got with his uniform in T3 is very similar to Doom's. Doom was actually very costly and okay, but not that great. With his uniform and T3, however, he became a menace overnight. And similarly, Warlock is doing the same this time around. Though, based off the results of my testing, he seems to be more oriented towards PvP as opposed to a high level of PvE performance. I rigorously tested him in timeline versus several different teams, as well as characters that were good against him, like Spider-Man, and his performance was actually really surprising. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the results of my testing for this insane rework. If you're wondering what the uniform options are for this uniform, you can see them here. They're not really the best options, and there is a pretty expensive one, with that being the endgame uniform for Thanos. Keep in mind that there is the potential that we might be getting a new uniform for Thanos, so if you are rushing to get that uniform option right away because you don't have it, maybe hold off a week or two. Similar to all my other tests, the first thing that I do is take the character into World Boss Ultimate Thanos with no strikers except for Groot for the healing to see how they do. If you're looking to build Warlock specifically for PvE, then a CTP of Rage will likely be your best option, since you have to use the 5th skill and delay cancel it to layer it on top of your other skills, which will probably mess up your proc if you run something like a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction. On top of that, the CTP of Destruction's penetration will be redundant with Warlock since he has it passively in his kit. And if you do run a Rage, he has guard break immunity built into his uniform, so you have the added benefit of having a little bit of versatility in being able to use him more effectively in PvE and quite possibly in PvP. The build that I initially tested with was a custom gear with HP and 3 or 4 seconds of invincible on it. However, stage 60 proved to be a little bit too easy, so I had to up it to stage 99 in order to get any kind of useful information from the clear time. The rotation that I tested that I found was most effective was to use the 4th skill and instantly cancel that into the 5th skill, delay canceling that after the yellow energy orb appears, into the 2nd skill, which I instantly canceled into the 3rd skill. And then I basically just stayed in the 3rd skill since it's a continuous damage skill till my skills were back up. If you want to try to maximize your damage a little bit more and fill up your ultimate faster, you can end the 3rd skill just about a second before your 4th and 5th skill are done, and spam your 1 and 2 quickly before going back into your rotation. With no damage proc, I finished stage 99 of Thanos with 1 minute and 43 seconds left. Once you have access to your T3 skill, the rotation becomes 4, cancel 6, delay cancel after the visual of the map changes into the 5th skill, delay cancel that into the 2nd skill, which you instantly cancel into your 3rd skill, and you stay in that for as long as the other skills are still on cooldown. As you can see from the timer above, because Warlock has all defense down that ignores immunity on his 4th skill, as well as his ultimate skill going up to 70% on the ult and 50% on the 4th skill, I'm able to essentially finish this fight in about 1 minute and 20 seconds, which is way faster than the Thanos fight, which is unaffected by the defense down mechanic. Before I actually T3 the character and put on a CTP, I wanted to see how he would perform at just level 70 with a regular custom gear. And like I said in the beginning of the video, the results were actually pretty surprising, since he was able to take out Doom and other really strong characters, even as far as ones with a support or 2 on them. I did end up dying versus this Wolverine, but that's kind of expected when a character isn't fully built, and when the opponent team is running supports and I'm just running a regular team. So here is another test versus some of the top characters for timeline, being Sentry and Doom. But unfortunately, because I was testing this as soon as it came out, I still have my challenger buffs on at this point, so they kind of interfered with the testing a little bit, because one of the challenger buffs that I have is that when the character gets to 1 health, he gets invincible. So I would have actually died in this fight and probably lost it, but the fact that I was able to take down both Sentry and Doom at this stage of the build is really interesting and shows you how good the character can be. As I mentioned in the intro, Warlock has an upgrade and playstyle very similar to Doom's, so you can see that he gains a massive energy increase of almost 21 or 22,000 and a massive HP bump of close to 40,000 or more. He also gets this really amazing animation when you T3 him, which I think is really cool. Also, if you're wondering how the stat bump compares, he seems to be a little bit ahead of the upgrade that Jean got when she went from T2 to T3. After seeing how well Warlock was performing from my initial tests, I decided to go all in and built him up fully in all the different ways possible, and ended up getting him to rank 5 overall. Funny enough, I could potentially push to a higher rank because I only ended up getting a 3-star artifact for him, and interestingly enough, you can see how he does with and without the artifact on in PvP, since I did test that. So once I got the character upgraded to T3, I was able to complete the same stage 99 of Thanos 40 seconds faster. Versus Cull Obsidian, however, my clear time was already pretty fast, so I only got an improvement of about 19 seconds. To get a better idea of how good his base damage is, including the T3, I took him into a Knull stage 14. I ended up finishing with around 40 seconds remaining, which isn't too bad, but as a native tier 2, I kind of expected him to perform a little bit better. I think that one of the main reasons why his PvE damage isn't as high as I expected is partially due to the design of his kit, because the damage accumulation is located on the 3rd skill, but the 3rd skill is also a continuous damage skill. You kind of can't really cancel that immediately to go into your other skills and layer them onto one another to build that damage up quickly. You kind of have to use the lingering skills first and then go into the 3rd skill and accumulate damage that way. Besides that, even though the ultimate skill is visually amazing, even with the special effects turned off, the damage, however, isn't really as great as I think it should be. From the testing that I did, which isn't included here, I tried out the ultimate by itself, and it ended up doing only about 2 health bars of damage on a stage 14 Knull. Due to these results and the testing that I did in ABX, which you'll see in a little bit, it seems that the character is mostly designed to be very good in PvP, but okay or just good in PvE. To give you an idea of the damage limitations when you don't have a damage proc, I used the exact same team setup and strikers, but this time on a stage 24 of Knull, and tried to see if I could get to that 30 health bar mark before the 3-minute mark, which means that that is the halfway point or the cutoff. Unfortunately, I was about 20 seconds too slow, which means that this character probably won't be able to clear the stage with no damage proc. Obviously, with a damage proc, that's not the case at all. So if you don't think the character is worth building for PvE, but you do kind of want to mess around with him in PvE, then you could also go with a hybrid build with something like a CTP of Greed, for example. Here is another test, this time in ABX with the no restrictions, to give you even more of an idea of his possible damage output. Even though he didn't have silence for this season, so I did kind of have to swap, I did end up reaching around the 7.5 million mark to probably the 8 million mark if I played him better. So that means that if you're running something like a rage build, you can expect anything from the 9 million to 10 million mark or possibly higher. I don't really see this character doing much in this mode, since there are some really strong blast types like Mephisto, for example, though during the paralysis week he might be able to possibly beat out Cable for the hero blast male category. He could very well do it, but because he doesn't have silence or burn in his kit, you would essentially just be building him for PvE for that one particular day of a season, as opposed to building him for PvP, which he is so predominant in. Which leads me into my final tests, being timeline, since Alliance Conquest hasn't started for me yet. The build that I currently am running with is a CTP of regen with that penetration effect when reforged. Some of the reasons why I decided to go with regen first is because the stat bump that he gets when he gets to T3 for his HP is really massive. His cooldown on his second skill is very low, and that gives him the 20% heal every time that he uses it, with the low cooldown that basically jumps up to 40% when you have the recovery from the regen. And if you're able to get the artifact like I did, the healing from that effectively doubles, meaning that he can basically stay topped up at full health almost all the time. It's actually pretty interesting because the character plays very similarly to a hybrid between Spider-Man and Doctor Doom. He's similar to Spider-Man because he has that heal on a low cooldown skill with the iframe ignore that he uses frequently, so that being the second skill for Warlock and the third skill for Spider-Man. And he's similar to Doctor Doom because he has a lot of long iframe skills, as well as that counter iframe ignore on his second skill, as well as the really high burst damage, especially on the second skill. Unfortunately, Spider-Man still has a really strong advantage versus Warlock and basically hard counters him, but his second skill burst damage is so high that if you get lucky, you can potentially take out a Spider-Man. And you can see that I actually almost did that, even though the opponent team has a Hela to reduce my damage even further. If I used Molecule Man or another damage support on my team, I would have been able to take out that character. And funny enough, in the second test, I was actually able to defeat the whole team, even without the need for extra help. Also note that these first 3 tests are with no artifact, whereas the other ones are with one. I have a grade 3 or a rank 3 artifact, which means that I get about 1.5% healing every second, which effectively doubles to 3% with the regen. You'll see the artifact working with the orange icon lighting up multiple times in the other fights. You can actually see the healing right from the start of this clip, and though while it isn't significant, being only 10,000 every tick or every second, over the course of 10 seconds, it essentially ends up being a third of my health recovered. So I wouldn't say that the artifact is absolutely necessary because he has frequent access to healing from his second skill, but it is a nice thing to have if you're trying to push in PvP content and make the character more annoying as well as more consistent. Also, it was kind of funny when I was editing that if you slow down his win animation, at least one frame of it looks like he's dabbing after he wins. Anyways, the reason that I previously mentioned that he plays like Doom is that if you're looking for alternative builds besides the regen, you can potentially go with a CTP of Authority, since his accumulation on his third doesn't conflict with it, or it shouldn't. And because we know how well Authority synergizes with Doom, it should work close to as well with Warlock, even though he doesn't have nearly as high damage mitigation as Doom does. You could potentially also use a CTP of Transcendence if you want a little bit of a middle ground, having the penetration instead of that steal effect from the Authority, and because he has guard break immunity built in, you won't suffer from being constantly guard broken. I've also seen a fair number of people successfully run a CTP of Greed on him, though he does need that extra kind of support from Colossus or some other kind of character to keep him from dying more easily. But even though the character can be killed more easily, he can perform pretty well because most of his skills have really high skill priority, meaning that he will use it before the opponent does, and the second skill has very high skill priority and that iframe ignore counter. The second skill already does ludicrous damage when the counter portion is activated, so with the greed on top of that, it's basically guaranteed to wipe out the opponent, especially if you have a reforged greed that has that ability to ignore any kind of increase to damage mitigation. That said, you can see that even with no damage proc, he has no difficulty at all taking out opponents. So just in case people thought that my challenger buffs were negatively affecting my testing, I also waited for the reset in order to get a few tests in and see if his performance really changes. But that clearly wasn't the case, and he is just as consistent. One of the reasons why he is so dominant in PvP, and for sure will be a top 3 staple for something like Timeline, is because of that high burst damage on his second skill, also having a low cooldown and healing on it, but also the high base damage and priority on his other skills, on top of the fact that his rotation on auto is just as amazing as Spider-Man, where he'll go into his second skill right off the bat to do that counter iframe ignore skill, and then go into his high damage fifth skill. The only real thing that this character is missing is a debuff leadership, though with his second skill giving you 5 seconds of debuff removal, you can actually run this character without a debuff leadership. Interestingly enough, in Challenger last week, a bunch of players weren't using a debuff leadership, including myself, because it was more beneficial to run 3 strong characters, especially ones that have debuff removal in their kit as is. So that would include Warlock and Spider-Man now, as well as a handful of others. So it's interesting that the debuff removal leadership isn't as useful as it used to be, and now I would say isn't really an absolute necessity. These last 2 tests that I did are with the character on manual if you want to get a better idea of how to use his skills and run through them. Usually when fighting against a character like Sentry that's pretty quick and can super guard break you, it's better to start off with your 5th skill, so you have some lingering damage there in case you get knocked out of the skill. Then you can easily go into your 2nd skill or the counter skill to finish him off. Spider-Man is a little bit trickier. You basically just want to keep spamming the 2nd skill, and immediately after the 2nd skill activates, either the counter effect or not the counter effect, you want to use the 1st skill. If you try to use any of the other skills, unfortunately they will be too slow and you won't be able to hit Spider-Man. Here is me fighting the same team again on manual to give you again a better idea of how to rotate through his skills. Generally speaking, you want to spam the 2nd skill as often as you can, especially if you are low health and if you see the opponent is casting some kind of damage to you, since that counter skill will immediately take them out. Then to avoid damage, you simply just stay in your 5th skill, and if you see the opponent is about to knock you out of it, or if you want some additional kind of survival or possibly extra damage, you can just tap and go into your 3rd skill, since it will give you that invincible and damage accumulation. Also, one final note, the 2nd skill, even though it is an iframe ignore, also gives you a buff that gives you iframe ignore across your other skills for a 3-second duration. You can see exactly what I'm talking about here, where after I've used the 2nd skill, the opponent is still in iframe, and I'm able to use the 1st skill, which doesn't have iframe ignore, to finish them off. This is one of the reasons why Warlock can potentially take out opponent Spider-Mans, because that iframe ignore buff allows him to use other skills versus a Spider-Man that is in iframe. In summary, Warlock is amazing for PvP and will undoubtedly be Timeline meta in the top 3 probably, and Alliance Conquest meta. That said, comparatively, he doesn't look as great or even close to as good in PvE. I have also done the testing for Drax and Gamora seems to be more in terms of PvE, since she doesn't really have too many iframes or any kind of skills to help her versus PvP characters, whereas Drax, even with no iframe ignore, actually is surprisingly really good in PvP, or more so than you would think. That does it for this video. I believe a bunch of people are doing videos for the World Boss Legend Ultron fights. I do have that unlocked, so if you are interested to see what I think about that or give you tips on that, please let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.